After initially being denied by its Supreme Court, the state of North Carolina has decided to redraw its districts one more time. North Carolina has become famous as being the state in the union that has done the best job of gerrymandering its districts. With the new electoral design, what we anticipate is that the state of North Carolina will only have 4 Democratic representatives in a state that frequently has highly competitive statewide elections, has had Democratic governors, and even went for Barack Obama in 2008. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are here to talk about the question of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has been a problem, as we will see, really going all the way before the birth of the Union. However, it has become increasingly controversial recently. Not only are we seeing an increasing rise in gerrymandering by both political parties, but we also have the Supreme Court stepping in racial gerrymanders that it is accusing states of engaging in, something that we thought had been gone for a long time. Joining me today for our conversation, we have 2 of our returning panelists, Mr. Cameron and Ms. Carroll. How are y'all doing this morning? Thank you for joining me.
Doing good.
Doing well, thank you.
You guys sound really, really excited to be here this bright and early day. So, well, let's just go ahead and jump on into it. So I started off by talking about the fact that we have this thing called gerrymandering, but we haven't actually explained what gerrymandering is. Would somebody mind explaining for the audience, when we talk about gerrymandering, what exactly is it that we're talking about?
So gerrymandering is redistricting a state for the advantage of a specific political party so that they can hopefully win more votes in the next election. That's redistricting based on their own personal gain, not the needs of the current population.
So I guess there's a couple of assumptions in there. When I'm engaging in gerrymandering, is it something that only happens at the state level, or could I have like cities trying to gerrymander or school districts try to gerrymander? Is it only a state level thing?
No, I think it happens at any level for different purposes, for school purpose or voter purpose.
Okay. Why should I consider this to be a problem? Well, let actually, before we get to that, before we get to why I should consider it a problem, that's a really big question. So you said that you're redrawing the districts to try and influence or predetermine the outcome to favor a person or a political party. How do you do that? I mean, it seems like you would basically have to know in advance who the individual candidates were, and then figure out who is going to like which individual candidates. How do I engage in a gerrymander? Explain the math to me.
Politicians today, it used to be you'd get out a massive map and get on your hands and knees and draw out districts, but now you can use massive amounts of data and computer programs. They'll use data such as partisan affiliation, race data, education data, wealth data, etc., to draw districts with a specific goal in mind, whether that be a partisan goal or a goal to protect incumbents, or a goal to create majority minority districts, anything like that. But they can use this wealth of data that they have at their fingertips to specifically engineer these districts for a specific purpose.
It seems like, so when we're talking about like majority minority districts, I mean, okay, I understand how that makes some sense, right? Like I could just find the African American neighborhoods and draw a circle around them, or whatever that logic looks like. But if I have a state like North Carolina that is basically 51-49 or 53-47, and they have 14 districts, what do they have to do? How do they make it work so that a state that is so evenly divided can have such skewed outcomes? What strategies do they use?
So they have 2 different methods. They're called cracking and packing. So cracking will separate these minority groups. They will separate them and spread them out across districts so that their vote doesn't really count as much. They can't make enough of a majority to elect a representative who reflects their beliefs. Packing is putting these minority groups together to create like one or few majority districts, but the rest are filled with other people who believe the same thing as the people that are gerrymandering. So there's only a few districts that can vote against what the people gerrymandering want.
Okay, so so the example that I gave of finding like an African American neighborhood or a group of African American neighborhoods and drawing a line around it, would that be cracking or packing?
I believe that would be packing. You'd be packing them into one district that would be, for example, solidly Democratic.
Okay. So why is that such a problem? Because it sounds to me like, especially if we're talking about packing, like we're talking about cracking, I guess I can kind of see it, right? Like you've got a district where you have a city or you have a county or a couple of counties that fall into a category. I can see why that's a problem. But why is it such a bad thing to take a district and say, okay, well, I'm going to give this minority group a district that is 85 or 90% part of 85% Hispanic or 85% African American. So then now these people are guaranteed to have a seat at the table. They're guaranteed to be able to have a seat in the state legislature, or I'm going to give them a school district seat or whatever it might be. Why is that a bad thing? How does that influence or change electoral outcomes?
So by doing that, it's not really accurately representing the population. So by putting all these people of one type of race or class or political party into one group, it's sure they get a seat or they get a few seats, but the state is more diverse than that. If they were spread out more into different districts, they would have a better chance of getting multiple seats and fairly representing the population.
So this sounds like a different type of representation, I think, because one of the things that I hear a lot of people talking about are these things like, identity representation. I want somebody from my identity group. I want actors who represent my minority group on the stage or on camera, or when I look at the House of Representatives, I want to see people who look like me. But you're suggesting that this identity representation might actually not be good for those people. Can you give me an example of why that might be the case?
Yeah, it wouldn't be good because, like I said, it doesn't fairly represent. So, like, if you have this district that's like 55% African American, and instead of separating them into other districts where like 30% African American, 20% Latino, and 50% white, that creates diversity, and people can vote accordingly. And actually, research has been shown that by putting different groups of people into different districts, those people can have an influence on each other. So even if African Americans hold a minority in a district, by putting more of those people into that district, they can have an influence on the other people around them. It's about community and influence and diversity.
So you're then thinking about democracy in this kind of deliberative sense that we have people who live around each other, who are in conversation with each other, and that for some reason, if I have a population that is 65% white, they're going to be more likely to listen to the minority population than if it's 80 or 85% white. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, it is, because I think that within a community, people can influence each other and give each other different ideas of who people are and how they operate.
Okay. So Landon, help me out then again. In terms of policy initiatives, or in terms of the kind of government that we receive, is there any evidence that suggests that our world is substantively different because gerrymandering occurs? Or is it more just about these questions of deliberative democracy and representation? Is there a functional impact?
As far as specific policies, I don't know that you could really make that argument. I guess you could say if there wasn't gerrymandering, this party would win, and therefore this policy would pass. But I think the harm of gerrymandering is more seen on an overall scale, in that it creates a legislature that is less competitive and less responsive. I think in Katie's research brief, she brought up a good example of the Wisconsin State Assembly, in which Democrats have repeatedly won majorities of the assembly vote statewide, yet Republicans will maintain a supermajority. And the opposite can be seen in the Nevada Assembly, in which Republicans will win a majority, but Democrats retain a supermajority. So overall, this gerrymandering creates a legislator that is less representative, less responsive, and less competitive, and that has negative impacts on our democracy.
Why is competition important? So I had a college professor. His name is Tom Brunell, and he wrote a book where he essentially made the argument that we would be better off if our elections were not competitive. And his argument was that if I know for certain that my candidate is going to win, and that if I pack every single district in America, so that the person who I vote for is almost certainly guaranteed to be the person who wins, that we would have happier voters, even if it meant that we would have some level of gerrymandering. But it sounds like you guys are suggesting that competition in and of itself is a good thing, and that having competitive elections is important for some reason. Is that your argument?
Yeah, I would say competitive elections are important to the spirit of any democracy. Without competitive elections, you can't hold your representative accountable. And in the case that you bring up, that may be fine to have some competitive elections if you agree with your representative. But if you're one of the minority that doesn't agree, and you never have the opportunity to hold a representative accountable that you think has wronged you, I think that would harm the spirit of our democracy. And Mark Dunkelman calculated in one of his studies that if we had truly competitive congressional elections, no gerrymandering, that there would be 11 million additional voters in congressional elections.
Okay, so that's a different thing. So that somehow you're suggesting that gerrymandering not simply decreases the level of competition, but drives down voter turnout?
That is one of the many negatives.
Why?
Because people don't feel motivated to turn out if they feel like they can't win.
So then in the example that I gave, where the majority of the people are absolutely sure that their candidate is going to win, so they're more likely to show up, you're worried about the other people, the people who are never going to be able to win. Yeah. And that's actually, so right now today, for those of you who end up watching this on the day that we recorded it, for those of you who watch it later, we're recording this on Tuesday, election day here in the state of Kentucky. And that's actually one of the questions that people are asking. I think there's a general sense that the will of the state of Kentucky is for our current governor, Andy Beshear, to be reelected. And yet at the same time, because Democrats are so unaccustomed to winning these elections, he may well lose simply because Democrats only show up whenever they're interested in national level politics. They just don't show up for statewide races in the way the Republicans do. So we've been talking about when discussing this, we've been using examples of like racial minority groups or partisanship. Are there times and places where gerrymanders are more likely to occur, or is it just sort of an equal opportunity destroyer of democracy?
Yeah, so gerrymandering is more likely to occur in a state in which a partisan body, such as the state legislature, has control over the redistricting process. And it is more likely to occur in that situation in which a single party holds control over that process. So, for example, North Carolina, I believe the state legislature has sole control, and even the governor doesn't have a veto role in the power of redistricting. So in that case, the state legislature, a partisan body, has control, and that partisan body is controlled by a singular party, the Republican Party.
And some of the top states that gerrymandering happens in are North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Louisiana, Utah, Texas, and Maryland. That's where we see it happen the most.
I mean, it's literally like all over the map. there doesn't seem to be a pattern. You said, whenever I think about a state like North Carolina, I mean, North Carolina, they're gerrymandering because North Carolina elections would be competitively close. You talked about, was it Wisconsin and Nevada, where state legislatures are basically flipping the opinions or the will of the people. But with a state like Texas, Texas doesn't strike me as being a state that needs to be gerrymandered a lot. I mean, that seems to be a pretty close Republican stronghold. Why would Texas or Mississippi or Alabama, why would Louisiana need to gerrymander districts? I mean, Louisiana seems to me to be a pretty solid Republican state. What's the motivation there? How is it somehow different?
Well, when you have as close national elections as we do, and the House of Representatives can come down to, for example, right now a 5-seat majority, national parties, Democrats and Republicans, have a reason to squeeze out every single seat they can in every state, no matter that be, one in Alabama turning into 2 for the Democrats, or if that be, Texas for Republicans in Texas increasing their seats by 3 or 4. Every seat counts whenever we have such close national elections.
So that kind of brings me back to the question I asked a second ago. If both political parties are gerrymandering, and if they're gerrymandering relatively equally, and if there isn't an apparent change in public policy with gerrymandering, sure, maybe more people show up and vote, but if those extra voters aren't changing the outcome of policy and somehow, I'm having a hard time really grasping why this is the thing that the Supreme Court should intervene in, or why this is the thing we should be worrying about. If it doesn't matter, then why does it matter?
So part of it, I believe, is the principle of it. Even though the Democratic Party started really gerrymandering in 2016, 2020 elections, the fact that districts are being redrawn not to better suit the population, but for a specific political party, I think most voters would disagree with that. But gerrymandering also has other negative effects, such as, like we talked about before, misrepresentation. But there's also the effect of segregating schools more. Obviously, not legally, and it's not in the same way that it used to happen and before Brown versus Board of Education. But this is happening in a more implicit way, where districts are being redrawn with minority populations grouped together, creating all of those people going to a school district where you might have more impoverished people in one school and then better off people, like more wealthy students in another school. And the school where the impoverished students are going, they might not have the best experience. Versus if these people were all grouped together and if it was equally district, then you would have students having similar opportunities at different schools.
So if all of the people, I'm thinking of growing up in Dallas, the problem, there was once a situation where of the 15 members in city council in a city of roughly 1.5 million people, most of them lived essentially in the same neighborhood because of the way the districts had been drawn. And unsurprisingly, those neighborhoods had really good schools and really great social services, whereas others didn't. And so those are the kinds of things that you're talking about. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense to me. So let's assume that I think that gerrymandering is a problem. Let's say that I'm on board, even though if it doesn't affect policy, maybe I'm not, but let's say I'm on board. How do you tell a legislature who has been given the authority to draw districts that it's not allowed to draw districts? Or are there ways that you can know in advance where districts have been gerrymandered? Like, are there tools that stop it? Or is gerrymandering just something that we're sort of stuck with?
Well, as far as taking the power away from the legislature, we've seen that increasingly happen in recent years. For example, today on the ballot in Ohio is a constitutional amendment to create an independent redistricting commission. So citizen initiatives such as that ballot amendment have been successful in taking away that power from the legislatures. I believe one passed a couple years ago in Michigan. And so citizens have a role in taking this power away from the legislature because they see it as the legislature abusing that power.
Are these constitutional amendments, are there reasons to believe, like, these legislative review boards or these districting boards, they're going to have to come into office somehow. So if that process is also partisan or racial in nature, it seems like you would have some of the same problems. How does that actually make things any better?
So the most effective of these commissions are usually nonpartisan. I had a specific author, Cottrell, who he created two broad categories, basically legislature initiated redistricting, which was controlled by a partisan legislature, and what he called non-legislative approaches. So that covered anything that wasn't controlled by the legislature. And his study showed that anything not controlled by the legislature increased electoral competition and responsiveness, and those things that we have seen decline with legislative controlled gerrymandering. So these representatives that were running in these states that had non-legislative approaches were more likely to face an opponent or a quality challenger. They were less likely to outspend their opponent, and they were less likely to win. And if they did win, they won with lower percentages. So that these non-legislative approaches have been shown to increase electoral competition.
So if competition and accountability are the things that you care for, then these things, that seems to be a little bit more successful. Anything else? Any other? I think we had, and you both may have been on the panel, I can't remember, but we had a conversation about proportional representation a few weeks ago. So any of you viewers who are interested, you can check that one out as well, unless that's how you ended up here. Proportional representation. Are there any states that have considered something like that, like altering fundamentally how we do elections or changing the number of houses in their legislatures to make gerrymandering more difficult? Or is it simply being focused on how we draw districts?
I didn't see anything about that in my research. I think it's mainly about districts being drawn, but Landon, you might have seen something different than me.
I agree. I haven't seen anything specifically. I'm not for sure about the constitutionality of doing away with legislative districts. I think that might conflict with Supreme Court opinions on one vote, one person, and the specific size of legislative districts.
Okay, so then are there any rules that have been provided by the courts or interpretations of the Constitution? Are there any rules that we should follow that would have the effect of limiting gerrymandering?
Not much has been done to limit this. It did go to the Supreme Court in Rucho versus Common Cause, and the court ultimately ruled that it was out of their jurisdiction because it was up to the states to decide what was allowed and what was not allowed in terms of gerrymandering and redistricting.
I mean, it strikes me as a problem that would be really hard to go away. So when you think about something like Ohio, or maybe Ohio is maybe not the best example, maybe Nevada or even North Carolina, I could see where voters, if they were always voting in one direction, like they do in Nevada, or you're suggesting that they do in Wisconsin, if the voters are always going in one direction and yet they never seem to be getting what they're wanting, I could see why voters might want to intervene to take this power away from the legislature so they could get what they wanted. At the same time, if I'm in a state, and North Carolina might be a good example of this, where North Carolina appears to be 51 or 2%, 52% Republican, the Republican Party has no incentive to try to adopt some kind of electoral reform. I mean, if I'm only 52% of the population, but I win 70% of the time, it seems like I would want to leave the rules exactly the way that they are, right? Like I think gerrymandering strikes me as being one of those things that losers care a lot more about than winners do. And since winners are in charge, why would they ever change anything?
And since the winners are in charge, they're the ones doing the redistricting, making it harder for the losers to vote the way they want to, and for those people to win. So it just kind of keeps going in a circle.
So we're in the last couple of minutes of the broadcast. As we wrap up, I guess here's the final question for you guys. And maybe it's a two-part question. Do you feel like, of the problems that we're facing as a country, do you feel like gerrymandering is something that we need to be worried about? And the last bit, do you think that gerrymandering is something that we have a legitimate chance of actually trying to fix? Or do you think the obstacles to stopping it are just too great? Landon, you go ahead and take this question first.
Yeah, I do think it is a legitimate problem that we face in the country. And I mean, not only its direct issues that it causes, but also its indirect effects. There's research that shows that these gerrymandering districts increases polarization in Congress and decreases incentive for bipartisanship and compromise. So I definitely think that could be some of the causes of our current dysfunction in Congress, that in its small majority. As far as our chance of solving the problem or doing away with gerrymandering, I think you made a good point about why it is so entrenched, since the dawn of our country, is that the people in power can keep themselves in power and they have no motivation to change that. I think, states that allow it, citizen initiatives is the way to go. Hopefully one day we can get a Supreme Court that will step in. But I mean, you've made a good point that the people in power aren't going to want to give up their power.
Ms. Carroll, where do you come down on this?
I also think that it is an important issue. The United States is becoming increasingly diverse and divisive, and gerrymandering affects both of those things. I think it's important that populations are accurately districted and therefore accurately represented, so that we have the people that are in the electorate being represented in the legislature, passing things that are important to these people. Voting and democracy is obviously the foundation of our country. It's so important, and gerrymandering affects these things. So I think it is an important issue. In terms of solving the problem, I'd have to agree with Landon. I think that putting it more in the hands of the citizens and the people who are voting and who are worried about their representation, I think that would be a good way to go. I think it just needs more awareness and more people getting mad about this to really vote for people that are going to say, hey, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to draw lines to my advantage, because we need to vote for people who value democracy.
Yeah, it would be nice. It's interesting voting for people who value democracy. One of the things that we were recently told by a speaker on campus, we were reminded one more time, America is not a democracy, it's a republic. And so democracy isn't necessarily a thing that we should be valuing. But I take your point. Well, to everybody who watched us live, or to anybody who's watching us later, greatly appreciate you joining us. We have one more senior seminar broadcast this year. We're going to be taking a week off, maybe, or maybe not, before we have our last broadcast. So join us next time, where we're going to be talking about this question of the purpose of prisons and of courts, and whether we should be focusing on criminal rehabilitation, or if our court system should be punishing before it's worrying about rehabilitating. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us. Have a good